very warm good evening to you all. Thank you very much for joining us this evening to listen to a talk under the title Science Shows That God Exists. And thank you and welcome to those online as well. So, now, of course, whilst we may sometimes hear that faith in science and faith in God cannot coexist, that acceptance of scientific laws leaves no room for belief in a God or in a creator who established those laws and who continues to direct world events. Today, hopefully, over the next few minutes, there'll be a short presentation that will add some added context and value on that. And I'm very pleased to welcome John Thorpe, who's going to give us a talk under that title. So, without any further introduction, I will hand over to John.
Well, good evening. It's said that science and God are mutually exclusive and that one disproves the other, but the reality is actually different from that. That the fact is that the findings of science strongly support the idea that there is a creator God behind it all. So, there are two possible ideas of God. There's a God inside the universe who causes natural phenomena, and that kind of God would be part of the mechanism of the world. As science found out more about the mechanism of the universe, such a God would have less and less area in which to work, and so it's a mechanism, and we refer to this as a God of the gaps. As the gaps are filled, that kind of God would vanish. But there's a different kind of God, and this is a God who is outside the universe and who created the laws of nature that govern the working of the universe. And the God of the Bible is that kind of God. He's a God who makes the laws on which the universe works, occasionally intervenes in it as well, but most of the time the universe follows the laws that God has put together. And that's the God of the Bible. The other kind of God is typical of the pagan polytheistic gods of the nations around Israel in the sort of Old Testament times, who would be a god of crops or a god of lightning or whatever. And the Bible describes those gods as idols and says they have no substance. And it's actually quite an important distinction. We're not looking for a God inside the world, but for a God who's outside the world, who made the world and who decides its working. And the important thing is that the evidence we can see supports the existence of a God outside the creation who made the world, who made the universe, and determined how it was going to work. And there are three levels of evidence. I'm not going to look at all of them. So that the first level is called an ontological set of arguments, and that's arguments just from logic and the definition of God. And the simplest ones don't really work. There are some very clever ones that have been produced recently, but it involves quite complicated arguments. I'm going to just ignore those anyway. It's maths, not science. Second level is the cosmological argument. That's the first cause arguments, which reason that God is required as a first cause to bring the universe into existence. And then the final set of arguments comes from design, and these arguments assert that the universe contains objects which are overwhelmingly unlikely to be the result of purposeless chance, and so must have been made by a creator who had a purpose in doing it. So we want to start off with a look at the cosmological argument, and that basically asks the question, why is there something rather than nothing? We all know there is something because here we are. But why is there not nothing? What makes it so that there is something around? And the way I want to think of this makes use of two important ideas. And the first of those ideas is the idea of a contingent entity or a contingent being. And something is contingent if it could be different from what it is. So this presentation could have been different. I could have had different slides, could have had no slides at all. Could have done it a different night. I might not have turned up at all. Got torpedoed by an American submarine on the way here or something like that. You know, it's all sorts of things could have happened. It could be different. And that means that it needs something outside it to explain why it's here. So this presentation is as it is because I wrote it like this and because I turned up to give it. But it requires me, and of course then you can say, well, what caused you? And so we go on. The other kind of entity is a necessary entity, and a necessary entity must be as it is. It couldn't be different. So it must be as it is, and that means it must exist. So there's no possibility of it not existing. And it doesn't require any other entity, therefore, to explain why it's like what it's like. It must be like what it's like, entirely self-existent. It's defined by itself. So let's see what this tells us about God. These two ideas are quite important. So we're going to start off with looking at the universe, and let's suppose we've got some contingent entity, which is what the red circle with a C in the middle is, and because it's contingent, it has to have something else that causes it or determines what it's going to be like or explains why it's like what it's like. Now, if that's another contingent entity, then we haven't gained very much, because now we have to explain what caused the earlier contingent entity. We've got a set of two contingent entities and we need a cause for them. And adding a third one doesn't help either. And in fact, it doesn't help no matter how far we go, no matter how often we add another contingent entity to try and explain it, we still have to explain the whole lot of them. The only way we can explain it is if we've got a necessary entity with a blue circle with the N in it, which causes everything else and doesn't require a cause. So let's think of an analogy. I've got a railway train, I've got a carriage. If I want it to move, then I've got to find something that will pull it. It doesn't have an engine. If what I do is attach another railway carriage to it, it's still not going to move. And I can carry on doing that. I can carry on adding as many carriages as I like. It won't move until I get an engine and stick that on the front. The same idea with the contingent entities. If I want to explain why there are contingent entities existing, I've got to in the end say there is a necessary entity that causes it. Here I've got the engine that pulls the train. What we've shown, formally we'd say any collection of contingent entities is itself contingent, therefore requires a cause. We've just shown that, and it requires a necessary entity to explain its existence. Okay, let's apply that to the universe. So, the universe is contingent. We know it's contingent. The laws of nature could be different from what they are, which is why we need the scientific method to work out what they are. If there could only be one way, all we have to do is to sit and think about it, and we'd get them all out. But we don't. We have to do experiments and make observations and use the methods of science to find out what those laws are. And of course, we know the universe came into existence as the result of a creation event in the past. Colloquially, this is known as the Big Bang. But before it was known as the Big Bang, it was known as the creation event. And that's how I like to think of it. That means the universe is contingent. It can only exist because somewhere there is a chain of causes, and at the beginning of that chain, there has to be a necessary entity. So there exists, therefore, a necessary entity who created the universe. It's outside the universe and created it. So the universe has a creator. Right? And we can say some things about it. First of all, this creator is self-existent. It doesn't need anything else or anyone else to bring him into existence. This is a creator who exists because he exists and for no other reason. We also know that because he is necessary, doesn't require anything else to explain what he's like, or then he's not limited by anything outside himself. The only limits he has are the limits he chooses to impose upon himself. And we can also deduce that this creator is very powerful. After all, he created an entire universe. So that makes him a very, very powerful being indeed. So that's the cosmological argument in a nutshell. Later on you can grill me about it if you want, but I'm going to pass on to a second argument, and this is the design argument. And the design argument's based on the idea that some objects can't be reasonably accounted for by a combination of pure chance and natural law. There's an example. That's an object that was recovered from an ancient shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. It was recovered in 1901. It must have gone down about 100 BC to 200 BC, somewhere like that. And initially it was sort of rather encrusted with bits of mud and all the rest of it. And they just thought it's a stone and part of the ballast. And they ignored it for a bit. But then it had been cleaned up a bit. And I'm afraid the picture is generated by AI, but it's a pretty accurate picture. It looks very like the one in Wikipedia, which I haven't used. And it was found to contain cogwheels and be quite complicated. Indeed, they x-rayed it and found it had more than 60 of these cogwheels inside it. And what's going on? There we go. That's it cleaned up by the magic of AI. It isn't that clean really, but that's what it would have looked like when it sort of finally sank into the water. And the cogwheels, they managed to work out more or less how they would go together. It turns out it's got little hands on it which would work out the position of the sun and the moon. You give it a date and it would tell you where the sun ought to be, a date and a time, where the sun ought to be, where the moon ought to be, where all the planets ought to be, the ones that they could see anyway. Also it will work out how long it was to the next Panhellenic Games, rather interesting. There's the extra thing which was important to them, no doubt. So it's fairly clear that mechanism was designed and built by a human artificer. It wasn't just a bit of the ballast. It's quite different from all the other bits. So why should we suppose that was designed and built by some technician in the ancient world, particularly if they didn't think they could make them like that early? Why should we think it? Well, the characteristics of something that's designed is that it has two things. It has purpose and it has complexity. So if you've got something with complexity which is directed to a purpose, then we would naturally suppose that it must have been designed. So by purpose, well, we mean that there's something special about the result of the system. It's producing something we'd recognise as being meaningful. By complexity, we mean that it's unlikely that the system would occur by chance. And if it's got both of those, then we would say it's probably designed. And the really important bit, that came up there, is this probability point here. If it's unlikely to have come about by undirected processes, then it's rational to conclude that it was designed. Now, the other thing that's on the slide there is you can design a system and make it look like it's completely random. So just because something looks random doesn't mean it isn't designed. There's just that little problem. But if we find something that looks like it's designed, then it probably is. And let's look at an example that isn't from nature. This is an exhibition of modern art that I went to. Actually, pretty well accidentally walked through a door and there it was. But anyway, that's what happened. And it was an exhibition about the difference between randomness and things that are planned. And there's one of these things on the floor. Actually, you can see I had bits of rope around it, so you could tell it was an exhibit, not just something random. But it's got this set of cubes which have letters on each of the 6 sides, and there they are, and it spells out the the word causal. If you look at it carefully, you can work out that it could also do casual, but in spite of putting all this I could find into the computer and asking it to do anagrams, I couldn't find any other words it would produce. So, where do we go? Well, there are two meaningful words, which are causal and casual. And if you just threw down the 6 cubes, actually they're quite heavy, but if you could do that, then there are 46,656 possible results you could get. So what's the probability of getting a meaningful word out of it? There are 2 meaningful words, so that's 2 in 46,656, which, as you've all worked out, is 1 in 23,328. Well, anyone believe that happened by chance? You only put a hand up if you think that happened by chance. I'll argue with you about it later. So that's something that we can pretty well reckon it's too unlikely, so we put it down to definitely being designed. Someone has placed those cubes there in that way. And in fact, there's extra evidence because it's an exhibition about difference between randomness and purpose. And he's got 2 words, causal and casual. There's only 2 words it could do. That's slightly cleverer than you'd think. And he's got the right letters on the cubes. If he'd got an X in the middle of that lot, it wouldn't spell anything. So there's extra evidence of design, but I can't calculate the probability of these other things. So we've got a low probability, 1 in 23,000-ish, and we decided that means that it's there by design rather than by chance. So let's look at some examples of things we can find and see whether they have a reasonable probability of existing. And one of the obvious points about the laws of nature that govern the universe is that they allow life to exist. Again, don't need to do many experiments to find that out, because we're, most of us anyway, alive at the moment. But even a very tiny change, the smallest change you can imagine in the laws of nature or in the physical constants that sort of regulate those laws, would mean that life was impossible. Think of an example, atoms. An atom consists of a positively charged nucleus surrounded by a negatively charged electrons. Unlike charges attract, like charges repel. So unlike charges attract, the electrons are attracted by the nucleus. The nucleus is made of protons. That's a hydrogen atom. It's got 1 electron and 1 proton. And the electron's kept in place by its attraction to the proton. And that is held together by electromagnetism, electromagnetic forces. And in general, the atom is electrically neutral because it's got 1 positive and 1 negative charge. And the negative charge on the electron exactly matches the electric charge on the proton. Right? Now, they're generated by completely different processes. The electron is just 1 particle. The proton's made out of 3 quarks and has all sorts of other things going on inside it. It's a quite different mechanism that generates the charge on the proton, but the 2 match exactly, so the atom is neutral. If they weren't exactly the same, then the atom would be charged, right? And it doesn't matter if the electrons are slightly more powerful than the protons, then it'll be negatively charged. If they were less powerful than the proton, it'll be positively charged, but they'll all be charged the same way. And like charges repel, and so atoms would repel one another electrically. Now, atoms are neutral, and the things like the Earth are held together by gravity. Things like the sun held together by gravity. But gravity is an awful lot weaker than the electric force. If you think about it, that paper clip is held together by electromagnetic forces. That's how it works. Molecules work like that. I'm holding it up quite happily. There's a whole earth full of gravity pulling it down, and it's quite happy to stay exactly where it is, as long as I hold it. It doesn't droop and fall to the ground. Electromagnetic forces are very, very much stronger than gravity. So only a small change in the charge of an electron, say, if it doesn't quite match a proton, would overcome the force of gravity, and planets couldn't form, stars couldn't form. You need planets for life, you need stars to produce the energy that keeps life going. So if the charged atoms repel one another, and if the difference in charge was only slight, it would overcome gravity. Now, looking at the strength, the two forces are very similar forces in many ways, but they're much, much different in strength. In fact, the ratio is 1 in 10 to the power 36. That's a 1 with 36 zeros after it. It's a big number. So it's a lot. 1 in 10 to 36 is a lot less likely than the simple 1 in 23,000 we were looking at before. So if you decide that those cubes on the floor were placed there deliberately rather than being random, you ought to decide that someone has deliberately decided that the charge on the electron and the charge on the proton are going to match one another. Just to give you an idea how big 1 in 10 to the 36 is, if you imagine a piece of metal, let's get a piece of metal, yeah. It goes right across the observable universe from one side to the other. Right? If you made it, got two of them, and the other one's got one extra atom diameter longer, that's 1 part in 10 to the power 36. It's a very, very big difference. And yet well, perhaps a very small difference, 1 over a very big difference. The fine-tuning that you have to have of the charge of the electron and the proton is amazing. You'd have to be very, very biased to decide that you couldn't believe someone purposefully designed them like that. So, can you believe it happened by chance? I can't. What else? We've got all sorts of other bits of evidence. Binding energy of a nucleus. If you make the binding energy of a nucleus just a little bit stronger, then the nuclear reactions that make the sun work become very much stronger, and the stars don't last for more than a few seconds before they sort of explode. If you do it the other way around, make them 6% weaker, then you don't get any stars at all. Stars don't burn, and in fact, you then don't get any atoms. You can't get atoms to stick together, and so you can't get helium, you can't get other elements, you're stuck with just hydrogen. That's a bit bad for chemistry, so no life. Another one is that if you think about the creation event, at that point the universe had kinetic energy. It's expanding, it had force that was pushing it apart, being overcome by gravity. If you make it a little bit stronger, the kinetic energy at the start of the universe, and the calculation is 1 part in 10 to the 15, not quite as good as the previous one, but it's still quite a lot, 1 with 15 zeros after it, then the universe would expand so fast that galaxies would be torn to bits, but not only galaxies, stars, planets, even atoms would be torn to bits. If you do it the other way around and make it 1 part in 10 to the 15 less powerful, then you've got a universe that lasts about 20 minutes before it collapses in on itself. That's not enough time for breakfast, let alone enough time for the whole of history to develop. A third one, the mass of the neutron, the mass of the proton. Neutrons decay. If they're bound to a proton, they don't decay, but they decay if they're in free space. So your nucleus holds together because the mass of the neutron isn't too big. If it's bigger, they would decay. If it was a lot smaller, then protons would become neutrons. They decay the other way. And if it's about 0.5% heavier as a neutron, then neutrons all decay and you only get protons, you only get hydrogen. If it's the other way around, then nothing happens. Everything turns into protons, and you can't get helium, you can't get your stars burning. So a whole load of these little examples. The nature of the universe is such that life is allowed, people can live. A tiny, tiny change in the physical constants or the way that nature works would mean that life was not possible. And we call that fine-tuning. If you go on the internet and try and look at arguments against fine-tuning, the people tend to assume it's something completely different. What I've said is what the fine-tuning argument is about, and it's just this idea that a tiny change in laws would mean there was no life. Now, it's a lot more unlikely that the universe is that fine-tuned than it was with the exhibit in the art gallery. So unlikely that you have to say there must be a purposeful being who put the laws like that. And that's got to be the person who made the laws, which is the creator of the universe. So we've got a creator of the universe, and the creator of the universe has a purpose which involves living beings, involves making living beings. If he didn't have that purpose, he could have made the laws many different ways and wouldn't have mattered. But he must have a purpose that involves life, because he's made laws very, very precisely put together to make life possible. So he's a purposeful creator. The other thing is that he managed to work out what would happen from these laws of nature. He says if he'd made one of gravity a little tiny bit stronger, say, then life would have been impossible. He was able to work that out. We don't fully understand it now. That's had millions of people working on it for a long time. God just did it. And he managed to get the rest of it, including probably laws of nature we haven't even tumbled to yet. He managed to get the whole lot worked out right at the beginning of creation. So there's an example from design. The laws of nature are designed in such a way that life is possible. Okay, let's look at a different set of things that appear to be designed. And think about life. So there's 4 kinds of things in living organisms. There are little molecules like water and sugars and things like that. There are big ones like proteins, which are made from amino acids. There's RNA and there's DNA. Right? And if you want to make most of the work, well, no, actually it's not. I understand no longer true. They now think that a lot of the work's done by RNA, but a lot of the work is done by proteins, as those I want to think about. And what happens? How do you make the right protein? There are many possible ones. You've got to get a protein that will do the right thing. What you do is you have your DNA, which contains instructions. Those instructions are decoded, and that produces the right protein molecule. So the DNA contains meaningful information which allows it to specify what proteins are going to be produced. Right. When you get written information, you tend to think there's a brain behind it. There's perhaps a mind rather than a brain behind it. You've got writing on the screen. You don't think that was a random set of pixels that just happened to come on the screen. It's as though someone has decided what that slide is going to contain. You've got something rather better than that in the human genome. You've got a lot of letters. So there are about 3 American billion bases in it. Each one could have 4 values, and they group together in 3s. I've said each one of those will be a letter. Actually, that comes out with rather more letters than are in our alphabet, but it's good for the people who don't want it to be purposeful, to put it this way. So you've got inside every one of your cells equivalent to a book containing about 1,000 million letters. including things like spaces and so on. Right, well, the works of Shakespeare are, well, they're 270th thereabouts of a billion in terms of the number of letters, according to the people who print them. So you've got to have an awful lot of information put together to make the first cells. So where did the first organism come from? If you try producing it at random, then it doesn't really work. This is the idea of you can give a monkey a typewriter and give it one go and see whether it produces the works of Shakespeare. There's one I've given it a shot. It's not likely to produce anything meaningful. They did try it at Twycross Zoo once. They put a word processor in a cage with some monkeys in. They got a lot of letter L, it turns out, and then the monkeys started using it as a toilet, but I understand it was running Windows 11, so there we go. Anyway, the monkey isn't going to produce anything meaningful. It's just, if it does hit keys at all, it'll just hit random ones. And it's the same problem with the information that lets you make proteins. Let's think just how likely you would be to get something like that. So, proteins work by having little molecules, amino acids, which stick together in a sequence. They're like a long chain of different amino acid residues stuck together. And the function of the protein has to be folded up to get the right shape. But the function of the protein depends on the sequence. And most proteins are quite big. This is one of the smallest proteins there are. And that one has 129, I think it is, or is it 135? 129. It's got 135 on the chart there, but that's because some of them exist in some versions of it and not in others. And it's a possible total of 135. I don't think any actual molecules do 135. So let's think, how likely is that to occur by chance, to get that right? Well, there are 20 different possible choices at each position on the chain. Right? And yes, that was right, 129 different molecules on the chain. So there's 20 to the power 129, which is 10 to the 167 different possible sequences. That's a lot, official description of that. Now, I have seen estimates that they always come up at less than 10 million different sequences that would do the right job. I'm going to call it 10 to the 7 because then I get 1 10 to the 160 by dividing one by the other. So we've got a probability of 1 in 10 to the power 160. That's, again, just to think how that compares. Well, first thing is that you need a lot more proteins than one for your life to work. Secondly, lysozyme is pretty much the smallest protein there is around. There are one or two that run it close, but it's a very small one. A lot of them are much, much bigger than that. And, well, you need more than one of them. The probability of one of them is quite amazing. Now, they estimate the number of elementary particles in the universe is about 10 to the power 80. Right? So if you had a universe for every particle in the universe, then the total number of particles in the whole lot would be 1 in 10 to the power 160. Right? So you've then got to find the right particle in one of these 10 to the 80 universes on your first go to get the same probability as the probability of getting your lysozyme right first time. It isn't very likely at all. So, again, origins of life. You can't get life by chance. At least it's so unlikely you wouldn't believe it. So, let's think about the logic of the thing. We've seen the universe contains systems that can't reasonably be considered to have arisen from undirected causes. And we looked at laws of nature, and we've looked at the basic chemicals of life. There's lots more we could do. So, those systems have to have a designer to make them. And the designer made the universe, so it must be outside the universe. And it's got to have a purpose. It's got to have put together life. It's a lot of effort to do that if you don't intend to do it. And so there's a purpose in creating life. He's got to know how to do it, which makes him greater than the greatest scientist. We don't know how to do it. So he's really very, very clever indeed. Clever is the wrong word. It's more than clever. And he's got the power to get it all together. So again, that fits the picture of God you got out of the Bible as well. So, what have we seen? Just to summarise, we looked at the cosmological argument, the idea that there has to be something to start it all off. And we said that it's because the universe is contingent, so it requires a necessary creator who is like the God of the Bible. Doesn't tell you everything about God, but everything you can find out about it fits in with the God of the Bible. Looked at the design argument. We looked at fine-tuning. We saw the laws of nature are fine-tuned, and it's vanishingly unlikely that that would happen without a creator. And we looked at biochemical design. We saw that life needs information to get it together right, and that the basic living chemicals are too unlikely to have arisen by chance. And that means that someone made it and put it all together. And you're going to start thinking, what's this being like? There's a thing called Pascal's wager, right? Pascal's wager doesn't hold together logically very well, but there's a thing called the inverse Pascal's wager, which is that whether you like it or not, just by being here, you've entered a lottery. You've entered a wager as to whether God exists or not. Get it wrong, and it could be quite bad. But you can't make a rational decision without information. So if you want to decide about whether you're going to commit to the existence of God or not, you need more information. And there are good places to look at the information. If I want to know what God is like, well, the Bible's a good place to look, for example. And that's where I want to end, with the point that you need to go on and look more about it. There is a God. You need to know more about him if things are going to make sense. So thank you for listening.
I'd like to thank John on your behalf for giving us a very interesting look and some really quite encouraging proofs on a different way of looking at how we can demonstrate that there is a God. And as John teased, at the end there, now that we've established that there is a God in another way of establishing that fact, the question remains, now what? What do we do next with that information? Do we take that and do we go from here? Do we, for watching online, do we close the laptop and carry on with our lives? Or do we take the next step? Do we open our Bibles and do we begin to read? Because this is the amazing thing that we forget, that the God who has made all of this has also communicated with us through the written word recorded for us in the Bible. And I'm very pleased to say that there is a plan for this world and for us, and we are able to have a part in that plan. There are also lots of other talks that happen in this building and also on this YouTube account, if that's where you're watching. And so there's plenty of other themes. For example, next week, God willing, on the 8th of March, Sunday the 8th of March, we have a public talk every week here at 1 p.m. And next Sunday's is under the title, We Believe Only the Bible Contains God's Words. And there are lots of other talks under the similar themes, covering anything from similar to what we've touched on now, to looking at prophecy, looking at history, looking at archaeological evidence for the Bible as well, all online, available for you. And of course, if you have any questions, very happy to work that through. But for now, thank you very much all for your time. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.